Some storms don't start with thunder, they begin in the quiet steps of a man who refuses to look away. Harrison Ford hadn't planned to be there that day. He wasn't on the program, he didn't wear a medal. But when a scream cut through the ceremony at the Air Museum, he moved, not like a hero, but like someone who had once stood too far away, and swore he'd never do that again. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story stays with you, don't forget to subscribe. The trumpet had just finished its last note when the scream sliced through the air. It wasn't part of the ceremony. It wasn't planned, rehearsed, or announced. It came sharp, sudden, and from a voice too small to belong to any soldier. A child's scream, high, panicked, and wrong enough to silence everything around it. Heads turned. Conversations stuttered to a halt. A woman in a sundress dropped her phone before she even knew why. On the edge of the reflecting pool, just beneath the bronze statue of a pilot in mid-salute, a boy no older than 8 was struggling in the grip of a man in a grey hoodie. The man's face was covered, a black balaclava pulled just beneath his eyes. His right hand moved. At first, it looked like he was reaching for something in his pocket. Then the light caught the blade. It wasn't small, it wasn't subtle. And it wasn't a warning. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The way the knife hovered near the child's throat told everyone enough. The plaza didn't explode into chaos. It cracked slowly in pieces, one scream, then another. A father yanked his daughter behind a row of folding chairs. A group of veterans stood frozen, their medals glinting in the sun as if confused about what world they now stood in. No one rushed forward. Not yet. Somewhere in the background, a loudspeaker continued to hum with the faint echoes of a national anthem that now felt like it belonged to another planet. The security perimeter wasn't ready. Officers shouted into radios, but they were too far, too scattered. The man didn't move, neither did the boy. The child's feet barely touched the bricks. His eyes were wide, lips trembling, one shoe already off, and then silence. Not the safe kind, the kind that waits to be broken. 100 phones lifted into the air, some to call, some to record, but no one acted. And then, on the far side of the plaza, near the edge of the crowd, where the flags shifted gently in the summer wind, a man stepped forward. He didn't shout, he didn't run, he just moved, slow and steady. His shoulders hunched slightly from age or habit. His jacket was plain, denim, the kind that's been worn too long to care about creases. A weathered pilot's cap shaded his face, one hand tucked in his pocket like it had no urgent place to be. At first, no one noticed him. Why would they? He didn't look like someone coming to save the day. He looked like someone who had shown up late, maybe for the ceremony, maybe just to walk. But he saw everything. His eyes moved only once, from the boy to the man with the knife, and then stayed still. The masked man didn't see him. Not yet. His focus was locked on the panic in front of him, on the trembling child, on the crowd that dared not cross the invisible line he had drawn with one hand and a blade. But the man with the pilot's cap didn't look afraid. He didn't freeze like the others. He just stopped walking, like something in the world had shifted, like a current had changed beneath his feet. Somewhere behind him, a child whispered to her mother, "Why is he moving?" But the mother didn't answer. She didn't know. She only saw a man step out of the crowd and stand still while everyone else stepped back. He didn't lift his voice. He didn't raise a fist. He simply became a presence in the chaos. And even though no one could name him yet, something about the way he moved, or didn't, made people start to hope again. The sun hadn't reached its peak yet. The air still held the coolness of early morning, mixed with the faint scent of grass clippings and jet fuel from the nearby tarmac. Flags hung motionless above the National Air Museum, waiting for a wind that hadn't arrived. Harrison Ford walked the perimeter of the reflecting pool, his steps slow, deliberate, not because of age, but because there was no reason to hurry. Beside him, a boy maybe 9, kept pace for half a second at a time before skipping ahead, then doubling back, tugging at Harrison's sleeve with questions that came faster than breath. Why do planes always fly in formations? Did you ever fly a jet with missiles? Is it true some pilots land with their eyes closed just to prove they can? Ford didn't answer all of them. He smiled at most, grunted at a few, and gave one or two the kind of quiet, thoughtful response that kids remember years later without knowing why. He wore a faded green jacket, the kind with pockets that knew the shape of his hands, and a pair of sunglasses with scratches along the frame. The brim of his cap was frayed. He didn't dress like someone expecting a ceremony. He looked like someone who came for a walk and maybe stayed longer than he meant to. The path curved toward the Garden of Valor, where a series of bronze plaques bore the names of fallen pilots, some famous, most not. Will slowed down when they reached it. His voice dropped. "Do you know anyone on the wall?" Harrison didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to one plaque near the corner, one that had been partially shaded by an overgrown tree branch. Neil Westbrook, that was the name. 1972–1999. It didn't say much else, just a symbol for wings and a phrase etched faintly below, "In flight forever." Ford reached out and gently pulled the branch aside. He didn't say the name aloud. He didn't need to. He remembered it like an echo. Neil had been younger by a few years, eager, stubborn, reckless in a way that made you nervous but proud. He used to hum in the cockpit during quiet flights. Loud enough to annoy, soft enough to make you miss it later. Neil had died during a training exercise. Engine failure, no ejection, no warning, just gone. Harrison had been filming halfway across the world when he got the call. He never made it to the service. He never said goodbye. And maybe that was part of why he came now, each year, walking the long way around the museum, never announcing himself, never stopping long enough for anyone to point. Not for the applause, not for the cameras, but because of a promise. The last real thing Neil ever said to him was over coffee, the kind that tastes like cardboard in military break rooms. He'd leaned over and whispered with a grin, "You'll outlive all of us, Harry. Just make sure someone remembers why we flew." So Harrison came back, not to be remembered, but to remember. Behind him, Will was reading names aloud, mispronouncing half of them, making stories up for the rest. He pointed at one plaque and said, "This guy sounds like a superhero." Harrison smiled faintly. That one was a test pilot. Lost during a night mission. The boy nodded slowly, then asked, "Were you ever scared when you flew?" Harrison didn't look at him. He looked at the water, still and quiet. "All the time," he said, then added, "But I flew anyway." Will took that in like a secret. They kept walking. Somewhere behind them, the crowd was beginning to swell near the main plaza. Loudspeakers hummed to life. Vendors rolled carts into position. The smell of hot pretzels crept into the breeze. Will asked, "Why don't you ever go up to the stage?" Harrison didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the strap of his bag, glanced toward the gathering crowd. Then he said, "Because I'm not here to be seen. I'm here to watch." Will blinked. "Watch what?" Harrison tilted his head toward the sea of schoolchildren arriving in rows, toward the ROTC students standing too stiff, toward the young officers who hadn't yet buried anyone. "Them," he said. "I told a friend I'd keep an eye on the next crew. That's why I'm here." Will didn't ask more. He just nodded, then grabbed Harrison's hand without thinking. They walked the last 100 feet together, past the monuments, past the names, toward the day that hadn't yet broken. And the wind, though still shy, had just begun to stir. The museum grounds had grown louder. Children clustered in matching t-shirts, clutching paper maps and plastic water bottles. Veterans stood in loose formations, jackets heavy with patches. Somewhere near the flagpoles, a microphone cracked to life, announcing the start of the dedication ceremony. But Harrison Ford didn't look toward the stage. He looked down, toward a granite bench at the edge of the courtyard, where a boy sat alone with his shoelaces untied and his hands gripping the edge like it was all that kept him from falling. The child couldn't have been more than 7. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for something, someone he hadn't found. He wasn't crying, not yet, but he was close. Ford didn't approach right away. He watched. The boy's breaths came too fast, shallow little gulps that didn't reach his stomach. His knees bounced once, twice. He looked down the path, then behind him, then back to the path again, lost, not just physically, unanchored. Ford took one step forward, then another, slow, measured, the way you approach a skittish animal or a memory you don't want to scare off. He crouched in front of the bench, just low enough to meet the boy's eye level, but not close enough to trap him. The boy blinked, frozen. Ford didn't ask his name, didn't ask where his parents were. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, crinkled square of foil. Inside was half a chocolate bar, broken clean, not bitten. He unfolded it gently and held it out with both hands, like an offering. The boy didn't move, not at first. Then slowly, very slowly, he reached out and took the chocolate with both hands like it was a glass sculpture. Still, no words, just breathing. Ford nodded once. That was enough. He sat back on his heels and waited. Not watching the crowd, not looking for the mother, just waited. 2 minutes passed like that, maybe 3. And then, from the far end of the row of display aircraft, a woman appeared, running, eyes wide, voice cracking, as she called a name no one else noticed. When she saw the boy, she dropped to her knees so fast she scraped both palms on the pavement. Her arms wrapped around him before he could turn fully toward her. She whispered something into his shoulder, the kind of whisper only a mother makes when relief and terror meet in the middle. Ford stood quietly, no ceremony. The woman looked up, her voice catching. "Thank you," she said, but didn't ask who he was. He gave a small nod, a barely there smile, then turned back toward the plaza. By now, Will had found a spot near the railing. His arms crossed over the top bar, narrating the arrival of the honor guard like a sportscaster with no microphone. Ford rejoined him without a word, slid his hands into his jacket pockets. Will glanced sideways. "That boy okay?" "Yeah," Ford said. "He's all right now." The flag behind them flapped once in the breeze, just enough to lift the edge and reveal a bronze emblem beneath it. Will pointed to the soldiers lining up. "Are they real soldiers?" Ford nodded. "Some of them. Not all soldiers carry rifles." "Then what do they carry?" Ford gestured toward one standing perfectly still. "Silence," he said. "They carry silence." Will wrinkled his nose. "That doesn't sound heavy." "It is," Ford replied. "It is when you hold it long enough for someone else to feel safe." Will didn't answer, but he didn't forget either. And the boy on the bench, still holding the broken chocolate in both hands, watched Ford walk away without ever knowing his name, but knowing, somehow, that he had just met the stillest man in the loudest place. He moved like vapor, not unseen, just unnoticed. A figure in a gray hoodie, hood drawn low despite the sun, shoulders hunched like the weight of the air was too much. He stayed near the edge of the staging area, where volunteers unloaded folding chairs and food vendors debated pretzel prices. No one asked him who he was. He didn't wear a badge, but he carried a clipboard, blank, and that was usually enough to make people assume he belonged. That was all he needed. He traced every angle, memorized every camera mounted to the light poles, studied their rotation speed, their blind spots, the half-second delays when they stuttered back to center. He counted exits, 3 of them close enough to reach in 20 seconds or less, but that wasn't the plan. He wasn't there to run, he was there to be heard. For the first time, his name wasn't on any list. Not for security, not for honor, not for anything. Devon Allen, 22, used to be the kid who stayed after class to tune the auditorium piano because no one else heard when the string was flat. He played cello, not because he was forced to, but because it made his hands feel steady. He once won a regional solo competition and cried when he got home, not because he was proud, but because Mariella had drawn his name on a poster with little stars around it and taped it to the kitchen wall. That wall was bare now. The apartment had been stripped slowly, month by month. First the TV, then the bikes, then the heater. Mariella's insulin had been the last thing they tried to save, until they couldn't. Devon remembered the night she died like a bad broadcast, static and fragments. She'd sat in the kitchen chair, head leaning back, too tired to eat, too tired to speak. He remembered trying CPR with shaking arms, his phone slipping from sweat and panic. He remembered the operator's voice saying to wait for help that never arrived. He remembered the silence after. He still heard it. In every empty hallway, every echo off a monument wall, every speech that used the word freedom like a slogan but never once said her name. Mariella was 16. She died because the price of staying alive was too high. And when Devon watched the coverage of another military parade, another flyover, another folded flag handed to another grieving mother, something in him fractured. Not because he hated the soldiers, but because no one ever asked why some wars happen quietly, why some battles are fought in kitchens with empty syringes and gas station receipts. He didn't want revenge, he wanted resonance. If no one would listen to grief, maybe they'd listen to noise. He shifted his backpack slightly, adjusting the strap across his chest. Inside was a folded sweatshirt, a pair of gloves, a letter written in blocky black ink, 4 paragraphs. No greeting, no name. The first paragraph recounted Mariella's death. The second asked how a nation that funds jets can't fund survival. The third didn't apologize. The fourth said only this: if no one hears me alive, they will hear me when the world holds its breath. He wasn't shaking. That surprised him. His pulse was steady, too steady, like the part of him that had once begged for help had gone quiet, and something colder had taken its place. He walked slowly toward the children's viewing section, where rows of fold-out chairs had been set up under thin shade tents. Parents passed out juice boxes. Little girls waved miniature flags. A boy with a gap in his teeth pointed at a jet in the sky and laughed. Devon didn't look at the aircraft. He looked at the crowd, not the uniforms, not the ceremony, the people. He touched the zipper of his hoodie like someone tracing a scar. His fingers grazed the edge of the folded balaclava beneath his shirt. Not yet. Soon. He would walk into the middle of the day, say one name, one sentence, and the silence would come, not to kill, just to freeze everything. Force the world to look. But then something shifted. A gust of wind, just light enough to ruffle the edge of his hoodie. A shadow fell across his face, not from clouds, but from memory. Because a few steps away, near a granite bench, he saw a child, alone, small, maybe 6, knees scraped, shoes untied, and for one flicker of a second, Devon stopped breathing. The boy's eyes, dark, round, too young to understand danger, looked almost exactly like Mariella's the year she gave him his first cello rosin block wrapped in notebook paper. He blinked. The image passed. His hand tightened on the backpack strap. The silence returned. No guilt, no panic, just the plan. He stepped forward, one hand brushing the child's shoulder, the other reaching into the bag. History wouldn't remember his name, but it would remember this moment. That was enough. The boy was still, too still. His arms pressed tight to his sides, his feet barely touching the ground as the masked man held him close, one arm locked across his chest, the other gripping a black combat knife that hovered just beneath his chin. Not deep, not yet, but close enough. The crowd had collapsed backward. Where there had been movement, there was now a ring of frozen air, a perimeter formed not by barricades or tape, but by fear. One woman sobbed into her hands. Another crouched behind a stroller, her phone shaking in her grip, filming something she'd never want to watch again. The boy's mother screamed, a raw, broken sound. She lunged forward and fell hard on the bricks, scraping her hands. She tried again, crawling this time, crying out his name like it might pull him back by force. But she couldn't reach him. No one could. Officers shouted into radios. One had his hand on his holster but didn't draw. Another barked orders but didn't step forward. Too many people, too much risk. One wrong move, and the blade would do what blades are made to do. And in the middle of all of it, the masked man didn't speak. He didn't move. He just breathed, each inhale louder than the last, each exhale slower, like he was trying to control something inside that had waited too long to break. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. Quiet, no rush. No sound, just movement. Harrison Ford didn't raise his hands, didn't shout his name. He just walked. One step, then another, steady as gravity. The kind of movement that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The crowd didn't recognize him all at once. Some turned their heads. Others followed the shift in energy, like animals sensing the storm before it hits. But the boy saw him. The boy's eyes widened, not with panic, but with something smaller. Recognition, not of fame, not of heroism, of safety. The man who gave him chocolate. The one who didn't ask questions. The one who waited. Harrison's collar shifted slightly in the breeze, just enough to reveal the faded edge of a pilot's patch long since sewn in and forgotten. His face was calm, not blank, not cold, just ready. The masked man saw him too. His eyes snapped toward the movement. His grip on the boy twitched. The blade rose a fraction. Harrison didn't stop. He took one more step, then another. Then paused. He was close enough now to see the sweat forming along the attacker's brow beneath the mask. Close enough to hear the shallow breath of the child, the tension in every muscle. Close enough to know that any sound might tip the world the wrong way. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The boy's breathing slowed. Not much, but enough. Enough to feel that someone had arrived who didn't come to run or scream or fight. Someone who had stood still before, a long time ago, in a place not unlike this one. The masked man tilted his head, confused, distracted. For the first time since it started, his focus faltered. And that in a moment like this was everything. Harrison's hands stayed low, loose, fingers open, palms relaxed. He didn't posture. He didn't perform. He simply occupied the space, filled it with something unspoken but heavy. Like time had curved toward him, and for a heartbeat no one breathed, no one shouted, the world waited. Then the boy whispered something, a sound so faint only Harrison heard it. He said, "Thank you," just that. Harrison blinked once. Not as a response, as acknowledgement. The masked man tensed. His voice, when it finally came, was dry and frayed. "Don't come closer." Harrison didn't. He stood exactly where he was, the knife pressed tighter against the boy's skin. One more inch, one more breath, and it would leave a mark that couldn't be taken back. Harrison didn't flinch. His voice was quiet when it came, not a challenge, not a plea. Just words placed carefully in the space between noise and silence. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm just here to keep him breathing." The man's eyes narrowed. His hand shook. Not much, but enough. Because now there was a line. An invisible one, between what he came to do and what he was still capable of stopping. Harrison Ford stood on that line, not as a soldier, not as an actor, as a man who had seen too many endings. A man who understood that stillness is not absence, it's presence. It's what fills the gap when fear tries to win. He took one step closer, and the world did not break. It bent, just slightly, toward a different ending. The plaza had gone quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels safe, but the kind that holds its breath because something is still breaking. The masked man kept the knife near the boy's neck, his arm trembling now in subtle pulses. He hadn't planned for this moment, not with the boy, not with the silence, and not with the man standing in front of him who hadn't raised a voice, hadn't drawn a weapon, and hadn't moved since the last step brought him into range. Harrison Ford stood still, but not passive. There was weight in his presence, the kind that doesn't come from titles or age, but from standing in the center of storms without asking to be spared. The masked man looked at him. His voice cracked when he spoke again. "You don't know what this is? You think I'm crazy?" Harrison's voice was steady, almost too calm. "I think you're drowning, and I've seen what happens when a man drowns quietly. I watched a man die once. A friend, he was in the cockpit next to mine, training exercise, routine. A warning light blinked, we followed protocol, but something went wrong on the descent. The engine stalled and we were too low. He didn't eject, I did. I didn't even realize it until the canopy blew. I landed a half-mile from the wreckage, couldn't reach him, couldn't see him, just the smoke. I sat there with a broken wrist and listened to the fire crackle, knowing he was inside it. The crowd didn't move. Not one person dared. The masked man blinked. "Why are you telling me this?" Harrison's eyes didn't leave his. "Because you're not the only one who's lost someone, and because I made a promise that day. That I wouldn't let another person burn because no one got close enough to see the flames." The man's grip faltered. "Not much, but enough." Harrison continued. "I've seen what grief does when it doesn't get heard. It doesn't disappear, it transforms. Into noise, into anger, into action that looks like justice but tastes like ash when it's over." The boy whimpered again, barely audible. The man glanced down at him, then back at Harrison. "I don't want to hurt him. I didn't come here to hurt anyone." "Then why is your knife touching his skin?" Harrison asked, not accusing, just asking. "Because people don't listen unless there's blood. They never listen to names. They listen to headlines." Harrison took a slow breath. "What's her name?" The man hesitated. "Mariella. She was 16, type 1 diabetes. She needed insulin. Our insurance was cut. My mom works cleaning night shifts at the hospital where they turned us away. Mariella rationed what was left, 2 weeks, one vial, and then she just stopped waking up. His voice caught folding in on itself. Harrison nodded, and no one said her name, not the paper, not the news. Not even the hospital that billed us 2 weeks later. They sent an invoice before they sent condolences. She died like she never existed. He looked up, fire in his eyes. And you expect me to stay quiet? Harrison didn't move. I expect you to choose what you plant in the fire. You're right, she deserves to be remembered. But right now, the only thing people will remember is your knife. Not her name, not her face, just the fear you brought to a child. The masked man's breathing grew uneven. I tried everything. I called every line, every clinic. I sat in a church I hadn't entered in 10 years. I waited for a miracle that never came. Harrison's voice softened. I know what that kind of waiting feels like. I've done it on mountaintops, in radio silence, waiting for a signal that meant someone survived. Sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't, and it never stops hurting. But that pain, it's not a weapon, it's a weight. If you throw it, it crushes. If you carry it, it teaches. The man's hand shook again. He looked down at the boy. The child stared back, wide-eyed, but no longer frozen in fear. There was something else now, not trust, not yet, but awareness, recognition. Harrison took a step closer, slowly, no threat in his body, just breath and gravity. You're standing on a line, son, and I'm not here to pull you back. I'm just here to make sure you don't step so far you can't find your way home. The man blinked. Tears formed, catching against the rim of his mask. She used to paint trees, on the walls of my room, bent trees, leaning into the wind. She said if we planted enough, the world wouldn't look so empty. Harrison's eyes softened. Then let today be one of those trees. Don't let it become a grave. The knife dipped lower, still in his hand, but no longer near the boy's skin. The man's shoulders trembled. I didn't know what else to do. I was so loud in my head, but no one heard me. Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper. I hear you, I hear her name, and I won't forget it, not after today, but let the boy go. Let him go for her. The man's grip loosened. His hand opened just slightly, just enough. And for the first time since the scream, the air felt like it might remember how to move again. The moment cracked not with sound, but with shift. Just a flicker, a breath. The masked man's heel pivoted slightly. His balance leaned too far left. The blade dipped, not in anger, not in decision, but in reflex. And that was all it took. Harrison Ford moved, not fast, not dramatic, but with the precision of a man who had made hundreds of landings in storms most pilots avoided. His left hand shot forward, locking around the attacker's wrist just before the knife could rise again. His right arm swept low and under, pulling the boy against him, pivoting the child's body away from danger behind the line of his own. The masked man staggered, off balance. Ford stepped with him, controlled, guiding, not striking. Just shifting the weight. The attacker dropped to one knee. Harrison placed him down more than forced him, like someone setting a burning object onto cold earth. The knife clattered to the pavement. A sharp, final sound. The crowd gasped. The boy stumbled backward, barefoot now, his shoe lost somewhere between panic and rescue. Ford reached behind without turning, found the child's shoulder, and gently pulled him closer. The boy clung to the side of his jacket, breathing fast but steady. The attacker stayed still. His chest rose, fell. His hands open now, the fight gone, the weight of everything catching up. 2 officers broke the ring. One pinned the attacker's arms. Another kicked the blade away, though it no longer mattered. The mother ran forward, dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around the boy and sobbed into his hair. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Some words are too big to fit in one breath. Harrison stood silent, unmoved, but not untouched. His eyes didn't glow with pride. They didn't water with relief. They just held gravity. He bent down, picked up the knife with 2 fingers, and set it gently on a nearby bench. Deliberate, clean, an officer approached. Are you all right, sir? Ford didn't answer, not right away. He looked at the attacker, now cuffed, his mask pushed half off. Young, too young for this much hurt. The man looked up at Harrison. There was no defiance in his face, just something hollow, something collapsed. If you lost someone too, he said, if you know what it feels like, why didn't you stand with me? Harrison didn't answer quickly. He held the man's gaze. Then he said, I did stand there once, long ago. I stood in the wreckage of a friend's plane and screamed into a sky that didn't answer. I almost picked up something sharp just to feel like I was doing something, but I didn't. Because I realized I was about to make someone else's Mariella. That boy, that mother, they don't deserve your grief. They deserve your silence. The kind that protects, not the kind that punishes. The attacker looked away, not in shame, in understanding. He didn't speak again, he just nodded barely. As the officers guided him toward a waiting cruiser, the boy stepped closer to Harrison. His voice was small. "You didn't let go." Harrison looked down. "No, I didn't." He held the boy's hand gently, steady. Behind them, the plaza slowly remembered how to breathe. People started to move. Some cried, some prayed, some just watched. But none of them would forget. Not the scream, not the stillness. Not the man who stepped forward without needing to be asked. Harrison found Will near the edge of the railing. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide. "You okay?" Ford asked. Will nodded. "Was that scary?" "Yes, but only until you moved." Harrison smiled faintly, not with victory, with relief. They walked together, hand in hand, past the monuments, past the chaos, toward the place where silence once waited. Someone behind them asked for a statement. A camera lifted. A reporter called his name, but Harrison didn't stop. He didn't speak. He just kept walking, because some moments aren't for headlines. They're for the people who hold on when everything else lets go. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.